Let's talk about housing and what's happening in the country. The whole agenda of affordable housing is not a new one. It's not new with this administration. Was there with the previous administration. Was in the manifesto for Kenya Kwanza, for Azimio, for I don't know. Did Wahiga Moras have affordable housing?
Yes, he did.
Yes. He did.
Yes, he did.
Oh yeah, okay, that one as well. Plus Wajakoya also was talking about housing, big time. Now there's the issue of the housing fund. Now, there's about understanding this whole issue. We have brought in an expert to talk to us about this morning. He is an architect by training. Dr. Architect Daniel MANDUKU was the founder director of the National Construction Authority. He is now a member of parliament for Nyaribari Masaba. He is a member of the Housing, Urban Planning and Public Works Committee of the National Assembly. Dr. Good morning.
Good morning.
Karibu sana.
Thank you very much.
It's good to have you back here.
It's always a pleasure to come to this studio. Yes.
I see the toll of Parliament is actually, the workload of Parliament is taking its toll on you.
Yeah, of course.
You have more graying hair than the last time you were here.
Yes.
It's a lot of work, isn't it? Mheshimiwa, even the last time you were here and you were joining this Housing and Urban Planning and Public Works Committee, you came and you talked about housing in this country.
Yes, it is.
And that's the time you came and you told us, you know what, first of all, our building code, there are very many things that need to happen before we even start talking about housing and affordable housing. There are many things that should happen from policy and legislation and practice. And then we shall talk about getting to bridge the housing gap. Now we are here. What will be coming before you shortly is the finance bill, which contains the proposal for housing fund. The people of Nyaribari Masaba must have asked you one or two questions. What are they saying?
Of course, what is clear out there is that there seems to be lack of adequate information. And in my opinion, lumping the housing levy together with the finance bill has misconstrued the initial intention. Obviously, bringing this bill together with the levy therein implies to most people that it's a tax. But in real sense, it is not a tax. And allow me to speak as an expert, not as a member of parliament here. The housing levy, as proposed in the current finance bill, is actually a mandatory contribution. And there are good things about it. First, it is capped at a maximum of 2,500 shillings per month. Secondly, the employer is under obligation to match the amount that the employee contributes. So it's a shilling for a shilling. Thirdly, there's an interest that you will get out of pulling these resources together. Fourthly, you can access your money after 7 years. To me, and looking at it as an expert, and as someone who has struggled for 30 years to try and getting the housing agenda off the road, it makes perfect sense. If you understand it from the point of view that it is a mandatory contribution.
So it's a contributory scheme,
It
like
is a contributory scheme.
NSSF.
Actually, it is very much like a provident fund. But I think because of the nature of our politics and because of the nature of the labor unions, the government saw it fit to bring it under the finance bill for obvious reasons, that it can easily be passed. But also, reading through the intention, and please allow me to speak as an expert.
You are speaking as an expert here. We have allowed you from the beginning.
This money will not go to the treasury. It will go to what we call custodian banks. Already, through a procurement process, 3 banks have been identified. One of the banks is KCB, there's Cooperative Bank, there's NCBA. Once this money is raised, it is put in these custodian banks, who will only invest it in the money market. That means T-bills or any other money instruments. Secondly, we are going to have an administrator. And in this case, and through a procurement process, Britam was picked. And thirdly, we're going to have a fund manager.
Why do we have 3 banks and only 1 insurance company? Why don't we have 3 insurance companies?
I think that is something we can debate about. But you see, this came as a result of a procurement process.
Okay. So the administrator, 1 administrator, 3 custodians, and the final one?
A fund manager.
The fund manager is how many?
So far, there's 1.
Okay.
But I must add that I know this was done last year, and I know their terms are coming to an end. So I think the government will open up
Fresh round.
And ask for fresh bids.
Okay.
And having worked if you worked in private sector like here, your pensions are obviously administered by an administrator.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the same model. What people fear, one is that they suspect that if the money goes through National Treasury, it may be misused,
Yes.
which is a legitimate concern
Yes.
based on our previous history and our experiences. Secondly, people ask, I already have a house. Why should I contribute a further 3%? But the answer is this. This is a mandatory contribution. And the idea is to create a pool of resources which can be used deliberately to have major projects undertaken in housing so that the common man can access decent housing. The housing agenda has been on the cards for very long in this country. In fact, I remember, and allow me to tell you this, in the year 1995, the UN Habitat, together with the Ministry of Public Works, had a competition. And that the idea at that time was to try and have what we call prototypes for the slum upgrading project in Kibera. And in October 1995, in commemoration of the World Habitat Day, 3 entries were picked of the best prototypes. And I remember receiving a prize from Professor Jonathan Ngen, who was Minister of Public Works. And 30 years later...
You're one of the winning entries.
Yes.
For prototype for
slum upgrading.
slum upgrading.
30 years later, the discussion has just been a discussion. Uhuru Kenyatta's administration only managed to construct 9,900 units. This administration, if it achieves its intention of having 200,000 houses per year, will greatly be in league with other developed countries. And I always like looking at best practice. If you go to Singapore, and I'm happy that the Prime Minister of Singapore was here just last week. Singapore developed its housing pool by having mandatory contributions. In fact, they have something they call the CPF, the Central Provident Fund. And theirs is even worse because it ties housing to medical and to a monthly annuity once you retire.
Right.
I think this is a model that the government is trying to borrow.
So it ties them theirs to housing,
health after you retire, and a
annuity.
monthly pay.
So it basically combines NSSF
It combines NSSF,
and housing,
yes,
And then
and
they
NHIF into one.
and it has worked very well.
yes, it
You're
has.
guaranteed of having a house.
Yes.
You're guaranteed of having a pension once you retire, and you're guaranteed of having lifelong medical cover.
Yes.
Don't ask about the governance issues in Kenya. That's a topic for another day. Ideally, it has worked very well in Singapore. And that's why today in Singapore, 92% of everyone in Singapore lives in a public housing or affordable housing or a social housing. In Thailand, it has worked very well. In fact, Thailand is even better than Singapore because the average income in Thailand is much lower. But through a similar system, 80.5% of Thailand's of the population of Thailand live in affordable or social housing. Why can't it work in Kenya?
We know why.
Why, City?
But anyway, that aside, I listened to the president's interview, and there's another dimension that he brought. That even in so doing, this money will be used to spur local industry and engage the 6 million or so people
Unemployed
in
youth.
some kind of income generating activity. And that is what we should look at as a country.
Daktari, forgive me. Every time what you've just said is said, unfortunately, I have to comment. For how long are we going to be told this same thing over and over and over? The Uhuru government told us this. This new government has come in, they're telling us the same thing. And you do not see signs of it happening. Money is spent, yes. And if the money is spent, it ought to spur the very things that you're saying. But we do not see it.
I think you have a point, and I agree with you. Our historical experience may give us a bias against this objective. But if it is well executed, and I've told you, there are signs and there are signs that it's going to be well executed by delinking the custodian of the funds from the administration, from the execution. Those are good signs already. That if governance structures are put in place, this will work. And don't forget, we are there to oversight this government and to tell it where it goes wrong. And we don't shy about that.
Please forgive me, but the house you belong to, you are a first-term MP. Their reputation is, in these matters of oversight, are horrible. Because the very debts we're grappling with here wouldn't be where it is if they hadn't increased our debt ceiling. The very things we keep talking about, we'll talk around it, we'll go back to oversight, and we'll find oversight was not provided adequately.
I think even you as a media have a role to do oversight.
We do.
And you do it very well. So we combine forces. I'll be in that house as a professional. You will play your role as the media. And I'm sure with our concerted efforts,
we can get it done.
We'll get it done.
I want to ask a question, because you've basically said this is going to be managed like a provident fund, like some of these other funds, like NSSF. Best way to mirror it is with NSSF. NSSF, the money is there, but then there are people who are managing the funds, right? They have a fund manager, they have admin, they have custodian banks, and they are in all those things. But then there's a board. There's a corporate management structure for NSSF that has a board that has representatives of the people who are contributing to this scheme. The employers and employees sit in the board of NSSF. Is it the same for the housing fund?
Good question. NSSF by nature has a very organized structure. But don't forget that NSSF is employer driven. That is why we have the employers sitting on the board of NSSF. And I think the challenge has been because of the Retirement Benefit Act, which puts ceilings on amounts to be expended in the, say, real estate sector. Now, the new housing fund doesn't have those structures. But then, there are regulations that were developed in 2018, which broadly explain how these funds will be administered. And these regulations were done through broad public participation. At that time, I remember I was in the sector, squarely in the sector, and we participated in making these regulations. Now, what has become a challenge is that even if the Housing Development Fund is alive, it has been voluntary. And so the savings are very low. In fact, we are talking of just about 2 billion shillings.
So far.
If this becomes mandatory, this amount will go to 9 billion shillings a month. And that will be adequate enough to do 50,000 houses every month.
Back to my question. What's the management and governance structure of the Housing Development Fund?
Well, so far, this will be administered by the National Housing Corporation. If you read the Housing Act, which
that is government alone.
Yes.
Okay.
But then there's room for improvement. Let me put that way. And because of the
should the first thing not be
had,
this? Because just the same way you're saying, in everything where employer-employee are contributing, NSSF, NHIF, the employer-employee is represented in the structure. There's broad representation in the board of NSSF. There's broad representation in the board of NHIF. Should it not be the same for the housing fund? When you say it's just the a National Housing Corporation that's in charge of this fund, you're basically saying it's a Ministry of Housing, the State Department for Housing that's in charge of the fund. Now,
Obviously, Eric,
open
you
it
have
up
a point.
for transparency's sake, because I'm contributing to it, and it's not a tax, it's my contribution. Let my representative sit on that board.
Agreed. And that is where we're having public participation going on. And those are some of the comments that we hope will be integrated into the new management structure of the fund. I think we should not, lose sight of the fact that
it can't happen with public participation for the finance bill.
I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the intention of the fund is to create a pool of resources so that our people can access affordable and decent housing. That should be the basic. Anything else can be built around that. And I believe that these are structures we can put in place.
My question always is, because honestly, I see, when I hear you, when I hear P.S. Hinga explaining it, I get it. I see what you're talking about. You're creating a pool here, then this pool will be used to help spur that accelerated housing development. The PPP, the private contractor, can come in here and borrow. Also is guaranteed offtake, because then the fund can purchase many of the units, and then the contributors will be paying for a longer period of time. All those things are clear. My question always is, why the rush? Because all those things we are talking about, in 2018, when you were discussing these matters, I'm sure you and other stakeholders raised various issues and concerns, and you put in a lot of input into this. Why come up with a rush? First time it was taken to court because of lack of sufficient public participation. And the workers that went to court, the employers that went to court, the Consumer Federation that went to court, were all arguing about, you have not engaged us adequately for this. This time, is there sufficient engagement with the public before we say, let's kick it off?
Obviously, Eric, from my discussions with my constituents and others, there hasn't been sufficient participation or even information with the public. That is guaranteed. But do we kill a scheme just because of that? Or do we work out to improve it? And my answer is, we need to improve it. And there's time for that. In fact, this can be brought as a separate legislation. But then, we may end up again with the same bureaucratic processes. We may create a monster, just like the NSSF, where we cannot even have access to those funds once we create that monster. Sometimes, and you need to read the book by Lee Kuan Yew, the first Prime Minister of Singapore. Sometimes the leader has to make a decision. If you start doing processes and having boards, we will be back to the same issue again.
I almost hear you saying that if you include people in this participation, Mheshimiwa, if you then say, okay, everybody give us a little bit of how you feel about this, that essentially the process will then become muddied and it'll take too long, as opposed to just getting the thing done without participation,
Analysis
which
paralysis.
the Constitution guarantees.
I think it's a question of a chicken and egg. What comes first? I believe that the vision bearer sometimes needs room to execute his vision. And we need to give them benefit of doubt. I believe that the intention to develop decent housing overrides all the other aspects.
Everything else?
Most.
It's contained here. It's Article 43 of the Constitution says, everybody has a right to a decent, affordable house, blah, 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 plus a good environment in Article 42, plus, sanitation. All those things would be addressed if we actually had proper housing structures. And we all agree that we have properly organized estates and housing and living areas would be much better. Everybody agrees on that. The question is, why not sit down and design it and then roll it out? Why start with one bit and then say we shall fix it as we go?
I think that's a good food for thought. And as Parliament, I think it is incumbent upon us to sit and actually develop proper legislation. We hope that when that time comes, then the public will be satisfied.
Yes.
Mheshimiwa, one of the things you said at the beginning of this was that you felt that this particular part of the housing bit should not have been lumped together with finance bill. Why?
Exactly what you're talking about. Because once it has been lumped with the finance bill, then there's a misconception that it's a tax.
It's a taxation.
There's also a second misconception that it is being hurried because the finance bill has got timelines. But the third and most perspective is that had it been done separately, and I hope we shall do that, then there's adequate input from stakeholders to a level where people are satisfied that this product is truly reflective of our wishes.
We are talking about the Housing Development Fund. What's it for? And he says, from a professional point of view, it makes sense. And you participated in the thinking and creation of the Housing Development Fund at the very beginning in 2018. And you say, at that point it was voluntary. There was not much public awareness. So that's why it has only taken up only 2 billion shillings so far. But if you make it mandatory, then you are able to create a bigger pool. I think that's what the people have an issue with, the mandatory aspect of it. And the mandatory aspect, because of where the money is coming from, it's coming from the same income where everything else is coming from. You have a mandatory NSSF contribution that's gone up. You have a mandatory NHIF contribution that's going up. You have taxes that are going up. Then you introduce another mandatory 2,500 cap of housing fund that's going somewhere. And the whole thing here is this sort of future benefit that you shall see for it. I think if people are saying that you put in a housing fund today and next week you go and apply for a house, people may see it better. How do you sell this so that people can then see, okay, if you it's the same thing as NSSF. Put in money now so that when you retire, you shall go and queue at NSSF and get money and wait for money.
You don't die before you actually get your money.
Because people see it that way. If you look at all the arguments that are even on social media, even NHIF, people say, even this NHIF you've increased. But you go to hospital, you're told, NHIF haijalipa, so utaenda kutafuta hospital ingine. Now you're talking about housing fund. Where are the houses? We first build the fund and then, those houses that the president is launching, they will be constructed and then people are just saying, a long story. One. Something in the future. In this Kenya. Future. How do you sell this?
We know the future. And what you're describing is not it. Yes.
Look at it this way. 2,500 shillings at a maximum cap per an employee. Consider how much money we spend on other things, non-essential, per month. Consider how much money we give to Harambes because of the broken down social system we live in. Either it's a funeral or it's a medical fundraiser.
Or school fees.
If you consider that this is your money that you're saving, and by the way, I sit on the committee for public debt, and you realize that we are suffering largely because we don't have a saving culture. The money that we borrow from China, Japan, are savings of those citizens. Now here, the government in its wisdom has brought a homegrown saving solution. And that is what we are essentially doing. We are saving the money for you. Because left alone, you will not save. And that is based on our historical, I don't know whether it's upbringing. We don't even save grain beyond the next season. Countries like China and the US have grain for 10 years. We are trying to inculcate a saving culture. This is your money. We are keeping it for you for 7 years in the housing fund. And you'll get it back with interest. On top of that, your employer will also match. The maximum that you can save under this scheme, or the maximum deductions that you can get, is 210,000 shillings. Now, when you start saving on day one, you can apply for a house, and you will get the house at 5% interest. Don't forget that when you pay interest, you also get a tax relief under the KRA Act. If you look at it broadly, it's a win-win situation. You save your money, you can get a house on day 1 or day 10 or whenever you want, and you can pass this benefit on to your kin.
Okay. Dr. You were the boss of National Housing.
National Construction.
Authority.
Yeah, same thing. See,
Different things.
same thing. I'll tell you why I'm saying it's the same thing. Because when you're head of National Construction Authority, that role we're talking about that Parliament has, that's what they had oversight. You make sure that everything that pertains to building codes, regulations, what have you, are done. And you can't have that if buildings are not being put up. Now, National Housing, yes, are the ones who used to put up these houses. Now, I can only take the view that the money was national government money to put up houses. And over the years, National Housing did an excellent job.
Correct.
The only problem was many of these houses were then left to the municipalities, local authority, to sort of like superintend and collect money.
Correct.
Some of those issues pertaining to what is owed have not been resolved to date.
A small correction.
Correct me.
As we are talking now, the National Housing Corporation took over most of the houses. There were very many outstanding debts arising out of the defunct municipal councils and city councils.
Yes.
The National Housing Corporation has been compensated, adequately compensated, through land. They have done what we call a debt swap. I owe you X shillings, I give you X acres. And this is a land pool that we have, that we are going to do these developments on.
So essentially all the debt that was owed by the former municipalities have now been settled.
Yes, if you go to estates like Makasembo in Kisumu,
Yes.
they now belong to National Housing Corporation. If you go to other estates, even in Nairobi here, Mariakani, all those have come back to National Housing Corporation from the defunct city council. So there's progress.
Now this makes my assertion even better, because if that is the case, and we have seen buildings being put up by National Housing, even in this city, Park Road, where we've seen it now. Some are bought, we assume some are rented. So you build, you sell, isn't it?
Correct.
So you get a little more money than what you actually spent, isn't it?
Correct.
Somewhere along the line. So it means National Housing has some money.
National Housing, correct, has some money, but then it cannot undertake projects to the scale that is intended.
I agree completely.
And with this kind of very, very big and aggressive housing program, you cannot finance this off balance sheet. You must get a different housing pool. You cannot have budgetary allocation to do 200,000 houses a year.
Correct. So
And that is why there must be an alternative funding model. And then, once you get the tenants occupying the houses, through the tenant purchase scheme, where you pay rent in a rent to own model, you are guaranteed of offtake. Because then, people will be paying as little rent as 2,500, 5,000, maximum 15,000. With this rent, you have a house, and you're paying back the cost of owning the house, and a small interest of 5%, which will eventually be passed on to those who have pooled their resources.
So the interest is basically payable to the fund.
Yes,
Right.
that is the intention. You get your 5% interest, your employer matches with your 210,000. When you walk out of the fund, you have more than doubled your money.
So do I hear you to be saying that you don't need to save for 6 months in order to apply?
No, you don't need to. In
soon
fact, you don't
as-
even have to save anything. You can apply today, and you're put on the queue. And we hope and we pray that it will also be a transparent process.
No. Let's take no. Tuache hiyo. Queue. People who are eligible, let's say there are 1 million and they're in the queue. But for this thing to be effected, it means that there has to be a process that guarantees a certain amount of money is actually collected before these things can be effected. Is that not so?
That's correct. And that is why,
Policy.
from our estimate, with 9 billion shillings a month, we can start the construction of at least 100,000 units immediately. Because in a year, we expect to collect at least 100 billion shillings. So if you do a quick math, 100 billion divided by roughly 1.52 million shillings per house.
So where does now the PPP come in? How then do you integrate the developers who come in as private contributors to this process?
Good question. There are many delivery models. The first model is what the traditional National Housing Corporation does. They take their land, they do the designs, they give what we call horizontal infrastructure, and then they sell these units to tenants.
Yeah.
The second model is where we have PPP partners who come and invest their money, and they're guaranteed two things. One, they're guaranteed offtake. Why? Because there's a housing pool.
Yeah.
All you have to do is to agree on the cost of the project, the delivery timelines, and once they give you the key, you pay them off. Hopefully they go to another site. Then you are left with allocating houses.
Yeah.
That is a second delivery model. The third delivery model is where everything is purely commercial. And unfortunately, that is what has been going on. And the statistics tell us that with that traditional model, we're only able to cater for 3% of the population. That means the strictly commercial model leaves out 97% of the
Because of the
population.
pricing. Because
Of the pricing, the cost of land,
Yeah.
cost of taxes.
Yes.
We must change the model so that we can have 97% of our people get access to housing.
The model just before this one makes sense, except for one thing. You want someone to build and complete the estates, and then you're paying him after.
You see, that
And
is
this is the
something.
government telling you they're going to pay you after.
That is something that happens, by the way. We have got what we call the build, operate, transfer.
yeah.
We've got the build, finance, transfer. This is what we're talking about. You build, you finance, you transfer to us.
But there's a guarantee
There's a
that
guarantee.
it will be taken. It's basically saying
And you see, you have sight of the funds also. You know, you're in this country. You know that in that pool,
there's money
there's
that
100
can pay
billion.
this.
And all you're asking for is 2 billion. And you're sure that if you deliver your houses on 1st of June 2024, you have your money.
You sign off
In fact, that is the best model.
Really? For whom?
Okay, so you've
for everybody,
for everyone.
I think, City.
I seek to understand. You've talked about the fact that if people are saving, because we're saying the maximum that you'll be asked to put out is 2,500, right?
Per month, yes.
Per month. Now, you're also saying that look, after 7 years, you can get your money back.
Correct.
Where is this money coming from that you can get back? Because the assumption is that you have a certain number of people who are contributing. The pool then would be 9 billion shillings. This 9 billion shillings then would then afford the government the space to be able to put up some units.
Correct.
Isn't it?
Correct.
So then after each individual then would have saved 210,000 shillings over a period of time, what you've essentially put aside is 210,000. It is not sufficient for you to purchase a home. What happens then is that from what I understand, this 210,000 shillings essentially is this club membership. But if you're going to attend the club on Sunday, you must still pay for your lunch. Now, paying for your lunch is this what now you will be paying your 5,000 every month in order for you to own this home.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
Now, for those individuals who do not want a home but have saved, where is their money? This money that you say you can get back after 7 years, where is it coming from?
You see, your question is actually a very good question. But how do banks work? How do banks work? The assumption, there's a model in banking which assumes that not everyone will go to collect his money on the same day.
Yeah.
The subscription to this fund is continuous. You'll start
Every
today.
month
There's somebody giving money.
You'll come on year 7. Someone else will come tomorrow. He'll come on year 7, day 1.
Yes.
Another one will come next week. He'll come year 7, week 2. Same like the banking model.
Some will come on the year 9.
If we all went to the banks today and took our money, the banks will close. But it never happens.
Sure, but you're still building, isn't it?
Yes, but you see,
From the same pool, the building is happening, and people can get their money back.
And
Yes.
people are repaying.
people are repaying. People are repaying.
And more contributions.
There are more contributions. And then once this fund is structured very well and it's working very well, we'll start getting what we call angel investors coming in and giving long-term credit at 0%. That happens. In China, for example, there are people who give loans at 0 interest.
And this is expected to happen all within this fund as well.
Obviously, once it is well administered and their governance structures put in place, you start attracting investors.
You do, Dr. You do, and everything you say can happen. But you see, the model you're speaking of strikes me more like the models that insurance companies have. But the reason why this one works, you see, you pay money, and they were told after a period of time, should something happen to you, for instance, depending on what you've taken, we will pay this percentage out, we'll do the other. When you have saved up to 3 years, you can borrow against this money. There are all these things that they bring into it. So it isn't just you're saving for the next 10 years and nothing happens in between. And then after those 10 years, then there's this lump sum.
I told you that this money, among other things, will be traded in the money market. So when you bring your 200,000 shillings,
Yes.
it is obviously going to grow.
Yes, it will grow. But
Why?
what
In two
else does
ways.
it give me? Apart from just this interest that I'm waiting for the future, what else does it give me? You're saying a house. So I get an interest at a certain point in time. I can apply for a house. What else?
What else do you want?
Insurance. Yes, exactly.
You know,
that's the right question.
I think you're bringing in a new dimension, which is a good thing, really.
No.
Which is a good thing. And I told you, when I started, I told you in Singapore, the same funds give the same central
Gives
provident
you
fund
health.
gives you a house, sorts your health out, and also gives you a monthly payment once you retire. Those are things that we can build in.
But
And
everything does not begin at the beginning.
No,
I
just-
agree that.
Just like our pension, CT.
Yes.
Right now, after very many years of having pension schemes in the country, the law now says, okay, so you get a tax relief with pension, you can use pension for mortgage, you can
correct.
use pension and this and the other. It's as it grows. I see an opportunity for it growing, for this thing growing. But all of us have got to have our eye on this ball constantly and thinking through it.
You see.
Because there are several things that are happening, and I see this. So, number one, as you can see, Mheshimiwa, even as you talk to everybody, there's a lot of skepticism and lack of awareness and lack of understanding.
That's true.
Which is what I find fault with those who are advocating for this. You should have taken time to go through and explain this very well to people, so people can just see this is a fund and this is what it will do. But and like you said, Mheshimiwa, don't mix it with the finance bill, because you put it in there. There's a new tax called housing tax, and it just becomes an issue. Secondly, if we all see the benefit of the fund and what the fund can do, because we keep talking about who told you need a house, who told you you're paying rent somewhere, what if you converted that rent into everybody has a need for a house. There's nobody who will say today, you know what,
and even if you have a house, who says you can't need a second house?
Yeah, who said you do not want a second house? Right? So the whole issue of who said I need a house is basically a pushback of unataka kuchukua pesa yangu,
Correct.
and I'm
already
not getting
suffering.
it. Yes.
Yeah.
If it was sold, we could all see the benefit. See, we are going to do this. Look at all that vast area of land in Eastlands. If we can convert that into better housing, and we have more people, and you get to own a house, you can rent to own, rent to live in, rent to rent out, whatever. You have a house that my housing fund gave me a house here. My housing fund gave me a house there. And then we continue. At that point, we start saying after 5 years, listen, this thing, we have contributed this much. What else do we get out of this? What else can we do with this fund?
Actually, Eric, your point is a valid one, but remember, the discussion wouldn't be taking place if the Retirement Benefits Authority didn't exist in its current form and hadn't innovated in the way it has. We now know that it can be done. So we don't have to wait 5 years. The pilot has been done. We've seen what can happen. You gave an answer to the solution. You gave a solution to this, to the question when you talked about Singapore. These benefits that I'm speaking of, you've already mentioned them. That's why I'm saying, why can't you? Your parliament, after all. Why can't you tie these benefits so that I know that It's not. I'm not just building a house.
I think it's a very good point, Eric, and you've put it very well. What I can say is that let us allow that these benefits be incremental in nature. Now and now that we have experience from the RBA Act and other jurisdictions like Singapore and Thailand, we can inbuild this with time. And I want to say something. The actual work behind this fund was done purely by very experienced actuarists, people who've done actuarial science, people who have managed hedge funds, people who have done banking at another level. And so there's a lot of work that has gone behind the scenes. And all the things you're saying were actually considered. But for lack of a better word, it was called the housing fund. Should have been called housing pool or something. And I agree with you. The mistake that we seem to have made is to rush this too fast and put it in the finance bill so that it becomes suspicious. But the intention, and I'll tell you again, sitting as an expert, this is the only way to go as a country. Otherwise, we'll talk about housing, and we'll never move beyond the 3% that we cater for. Remember, at the census of 2019, we had 1,441 slums. In the census of 2009, we had 814 slums. In 10 years, we've doubled our slums.
Yeah.
Unless we do something, in the census of 2029, we'll have 3,000 slums. Is that what we want as a country?
No, we do not. But if we leave the trust issues aside, the benefits that the government promises its citizens in the future is something that we will not accept because we do not trust the government.
And even as you talk about that, so even if you put trust issues aside, put aside the politics, because we must also accept that this is heavily political, whichever way you want to look at it, and to say, if we're going to save Kenya from the housing crisis that it currently is experiencing, the people that you talk about, for example, who reside in these slums, how well do they understand this process? Do they understand anything about this at all? Instead of using public participation as a tick-the-box exercise tool, how about you use that as an awareness tool to tell people about exactly what it is? Because truth be told, sometimes we want to be, we want to give you pushback. But the truth of the matter is that if this thing is explained to people, there could be some who would jump onto, your side of the tracks. But it's not being explained to folks. Somebody who is struggling to live, right?
That I agree.
And would get a house in the future that could be of benefit to them is not understanding this process. And we don't see effort being made for them to understand it.
So I think from where I sit, I will actually tell the Minister for Housing that there needs to be adequate dissemination of information to the public, because that is what is lacking.
Yep.
And I hope that he'll pick the cue and tell his officers to ensure that the whole country is well informed about this whole fund.
And bring people who understand this. Keep the politicians away. Those people who designed it, can they be the ones that come to sell it to us?
That's a very
the actuaries, the architects such as yourselves. They should be the ones who are telling us. Bringing a politician.
But I'm a politician.
Not your kind of politician.
They wanted to change the money. Nobody in Kenya was asking why, how. We understood it clearly from the beginning to the end why they were changing money.
Because it was a central bank and its officials doing
and
it.
You saw them
if
coming
you had
out
brought in
talking.
politicians, they said, badilisha pesa. Pesa.
Never.
Mheshimiwa, thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric. It's always good to be here. And thank you for inviting me over and over again.
Keep coming.
Whenever you invite me, I'll always come.
Very good.
Thank you.
The Honorable Dr. Architect Daniel Manduku, MP Nyaribari Masava, has been our guest. Keep it here.